So often, we've seen presenters dive straight into the content of a presentation without really taking the time they need to in order to engage the audience and to get them connected with the content that they're going to present. Now, that brings us on to the topic of structure. And structure is important for both the audience, who really need to have a roadmap of what you're going to cover and how you're going to cover it, but also for you as a presenter, having a really clear structure makes it easier for you to remember what you're going to talk about and the order that you're going to be presenting it in. So, what is an appropriate structure for you to use in the context of the presentations you give? Jeremy.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about the start. Tom's going to talk to you about the middle section of the structure, and I'll talk to you about the ending. So the start is absolutely critical. That's when you either get the audience or lose them. And as Tom said, sometimes people just rush in too quickly. Here is a sequence that you can use that will allow you to really engage with any audience, whether it's 10 people or 1,000 people. So the first thing that most audiences typically see is the title on the slide if you're using a PowerPoint slide. And often we've seen in business presentations that title is frankly incredibly boring. So make it compelling. If you think about business books that are still out there and famous, How to Win Friends and Influence People as an example, that's a great title. So what title can you come up with which will captivate and engage any audience? So that's the first thing they'll see. Now, the reality is that when you start a presentation, most business presenters will start with something along the lines of, "Good morning everyone, my name is Jeremy Castle. I'm delighted to be with you here today. Thanks a lot for having me along. I'm looking forward to talking to you about that sort of stuff." And frankly, it's just a bit boring. So what we suggest is using spikes, or one spike. And a spike is a sentence or series of sentences that grabs the audience's attention and keeps them really engaged right at the start. What can you say that encapsulates the key message that you want to talk about? That's what we're focusing on here. So let me give you some examples of spikes. Here is a managing director of a telecoms company looking for investment in his business. And here's how he started. He started by saying this: 50% of the world's population have neither received nor made a telephone call. Now, isn't that a great spike? That's a good way of really grabbing the audience's attention. Another spike was said by someone who was on a London committee looking at the congestion charge, and he said this: "We need to extend the congestion charge to Chelsea and Fulham. If we don't do that, within the next 25 years, all the trees within the M25 will have been destroyed." Now, again, you could say, well, is that true? Is it going to really happen? But it's certainly a way of engaging the audience. There was a QC in a London courtroom who said, perspicacious, academic, intellectual. Those are at least 3 words that the defendant can't even spell. So again, that's another example of a spike, grabbing the audience's attention. So when you've got a presentation coming up, what can you do to grab the audience's attention right at the beginning of the presentation?
Essentially what you're saying is that wherever the audience's heads and minds are when they walk in the room, that spike is your opportunity to adjust it so that they're focusing now on the content that you want to give them.
Exactly, as quickly as possible, rather than that rather boring start that we talked about. So you've got a title up there that's interesting, you've made a compelling start by using a spike, then where do you get to? A lot of times you're going to have to introduce yourselves. If it's an internal presentation, then of course you won't have to. But if it's an external one, you need to introduce yourself. So tell them something about you that's vaguely interesting. Don't just say your role and how long you've been in tenure. Tell them something that's compelling and interesting so they want to listen to you. So there'll be a bit on credentials.
And I think really important there is people underuse the opportunity to tell war stories or anecdotes about how maybe they've helped a client do a certain thing. So when you're credentializing, really important to engage the audience with appropriate credentials.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly right, Tom. So you've done the credentializing, if you've had to do that, then what do you focus on? Well, we would suggest that you remember this mnemonic, COMB, C-O-M-B. So what does C stand for? C is for context. So what is the relevance of this particular presentation to the audience? That's what we're looking for there. O is for outcome. What are you going to achieve by delivering this presentation for the audience? M is for map, or another word is agenda. So spell out what you're going to be covering, because an audience likes to know, what you're going to be focusing on during a presentation. And B is for benefits. Now that's where you're selling the idea of the presentation to the audience. So you can do this by telling a story. You talked about anecdotes already, telling a story. You can ask rhetorical questions. You could put an interesting visual up, or you could talk about benefits. And you could talk about the benefits that the audience will get if they listen carefully to this presentation. If you're going to use benefits, then use power words like improve, save, solve, reduce, those power words in terms of what are the benefits the audience will get from listening to the presentation. You've essentially got to sell the idea of the presentation to the audience.
Yeah, because they're only going to listen if there's a strong what's in it for me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So once you've covered comb, then you need to just cover simple things like, are you going to take any questions? If so, at what stage? So the two basic models are you take questions throughout or you take questions at the end. When we do formal pitching, what we tend to suggest, because you'll only have a short period of time for the pitching, is that you do a 10 or a 15 minute pitch and then you get into the discussion for the other 30, 45 minutes or so. And then the final thing is you focus on timing and you just tell them how long it's going to take. Give them a bandwidth, so tell them it's going to take between 25 minutes to 30 minutes, something like that. So the start of the presentation is likely to be around about 10% of your total presentation.
Yeah, and once you've got that right, that really important first 10%, around 80% of the overall time of the presentation is going to be spent on the middle section. And the middle section is really all about what you're telling them.
Yeah.
So that's all about the content. Really important when you think about content is how you position the messages that you're making.
Yeah.
So we would suggest that ideally you would have one key message that you want to give.
Yep.
Something that you can summarize up front and you can keep as a theme.
Yes,
exactly. Very easy to remember one key theme. If you can't keep it to one, then a really powerful number to remember is the power of 3. So things grouped together in threes are inherently more memorable. And I think we can think of a few examples.
Well,
so,
Nike,
just do it.
Yeah, L'Oreal.
You're worth it.
Yeah, McDonald's.
I'm loving it.
Yeah, those are all examples of the power of 3. And the power of 3 is littered into advertising, sales, the political spectrum. A lot of speeches or political slogans are in 3s.
Yeah, so if you can come up with 3 key elements, 3 key messages, if you will, in your presentation, and give those messages at the start of that main 80% content, then you're on to a good start, because you stand a chance of making it even more memorable. So when you get into the content itself, it's really important to recognise that generally we have limited slots of short-term memory available.
Yeah.
And what that means is that it's very easy to overload the audience with too much information. Now, there's a guy called George Miller who in 1956 released a paper which talks about the number of slots available in the short-term memory, and he calls it the magic number. And that number is 7 plus or minus 2.
Yeah.
So between 5 and 9 pieces of information. As soon as you get up towards the upper limit of that, so 7, 8, 9 pieces of information, the chances are every additional piece of information you give might mean that something's got to fall out.
And the reality is that we think that many business presentations just have far too much content in there. It's a major mistake, and it's because people want to give value. So they put as much content in as they can because they want to give value to the audience. But the reality is that it switches the audience off or it bores them.
Absolutely. So if you do feel that you've got a lot of content you need to get across, keep your presentation to that 7 plus or minus 2 figure. There's nothing to stop you giving handouts that have more detail.
Yeah, quite.
Because there are some people in the audience
who
will want more detail. Absolutely. So 7 plus or minus 2 as a way of structuring your key points. So that's how you might deal with the middle. But then, of course, you've got to be able to end the presentation effectively.
And actually, there are 3 sort of elements to the ending.
Yeah.
The first part of the ending is when you're summarising and pulling together some of the strands of your presentation. So the first part of it is going to be, less than the 10% or so of the start of the presentation. You're just trying to pull together the key points you've made. You link into the WIIFM, the famous radio station, What's in it for me, and you give them ideally a call to action.
Yeah.
So a call to action is, what are you expecting the audience to do as a result of attending your presentation?
And I think what we find is that too often people assume that the audience knows what that is and assumes that they're motivated to do it, rather than give a clear instruction. Here's what we want you to do now.
So you've got a first summary, which just encapsulates that what we just talked about. Then for many presentations, not all, but for many, you can then go into questions, aren't you? And actually, questions are something that many presenters really fear and worry about. So we've actually got a separate video on how to answer questions effectively. So if you're interested in that, then take a look at that video. Now, let's have a look at questions. That's going to take anything from, 5 minutes to half an hour or so. You'll take the questions, and then when the inherent problem with questions is that you might get a question to which you don't know the answer. So the way out of it is this: after questions, have a final message. So you take the questions and then you have a final message. So let's say in a pitch situation, what often we do is in a pitch is we take questions and then we finally say, look, we believe we're a great match for you. We passionately and enthusiastically want to do this work, so we hope that you're going to choose us. That will be our final message.
Yeah, and I guess what that protects against is the possibility that based on the sheer chance of question that an audience member could ask, it could lower the emotional state of the audience. And we've seen that too often. We've seen too often presentations that have finished on a high and then we've taken questions and the audience leaves on a low because of the last question. This way, taking questions and then giving a strong summary, it prohibits that happening.
Exactly. So for those of you who struggle with how to create a structure, here's what we've done. We've told you to focus on the start because of the importance of primacy. Remember the spike, remember comb, remember the credentials, questions and timing. Then going into the middle, 7 plus or minus 2, power of 3. Then you have a summary which wraps everything up with a what's in it for me and a call to action and summary of the key points. Going to go into questions and then you have a final message. If you follow that structure, you will give outstanding presentations.